One, we're going to look at a simple empirical formula calculation where we're given the mass of the different components of the compound, and then from that we determine what the empirical formula is. So our problem is a compound containing nitrogen and oxygen decomposed and produces 24.5 grams of nitrogen and 70.0 grams of oxygen. What is the compound's empirical formula? So we know the mass of our two constituents of the compound. Every time we have empirical formula or molecular formula, we need to convert grams into moles. So whenever I compare, the chemical formula of a compound like H2O, those subscripts always represent the mole ratio. So that means there's 2 moles of hydrogen to 1 mole of oxygen. And so I need to make sure I figure out the number of moles and then look at what those mole ratios are. So if I have 24.5 grams of nitrogen, I need to look up the mass of nitrogen in the periodic table. This is 14.01 grams in 1 mole of nitrogen. So I divide 24.5 by 14.01. That tells me that's 1.75 moles of nitrogen. And now I'm going to look at the oxygen. I have 70.0 grams of oxygen. Oxygen is 16, might be 15.994 if you look up a certain different periodic table. But that will just affect our rounding only minorly, so it's not a big deal. So 70 divided by 16 is 4.38 moles of oxygen. So now I need to compare these two. And so I need to do two things. The first thing is I need to divide by the smallest subscript. I need to divide both of those by the small subscript. And then the second thing is, if needed, multiply to get a whole number. And we'll go through both of these steps so you can see what I mean. All right, so if I took these mole ratios, 1.75 and 4.38 that we calculated, those are like the subscripts of my compound. So I have nitrogen, and I have 1.75 moles, and I have oxygen, and I have 4.38. But we don't like to have decimals or fractions as our subscripts. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pick the smallest of those two numbers, which is 1.75, and I'm going to divide both of those numbers by the smallest number. So if I divide 1.75 by itself, that gives me 1. And if I have 4.38 divided by 1.75, this comes out to 2.5. So if these were both whole numbers, then I would be done. But it's not. I have 1, which is a whole number, and 2.5, which is not. So now I need to go to step 2, which is, if needed, multiply to get a whole number. So 2.5, I'm going to start with the smallest number I can and multiply until I get a whole number. If I multiply 2.5 by 2, that gives me 5. So I need to multiply both subscripts here, my 1 and my 2.5 by 2. So 1 times 2 is 2, and 2.5 times 2 is 5. So that means my chemical formula for this problem, my empirical formula, is N2O5.